The Seven Dials Mystery. By Agatha Christie. Chapter 31. The Seven Dials. Very slowly Bundle returned to consciousness. She was aware of a dark, spinning blackness, the center of which was a violent, throbbing ache. Punctuating this were sounds. A voice that she knew very well saying the same thing over and over again. The blackness spun less violently. The ache was now definitely located as being in Bundle's own head. And she was sufficiently herself to take an interest in what the voice was saying. "Darling, darling Bundle. Oh, darling Bundle. She's dead, I know she's dead. Oh, my darling. Bundle, darling, darling Bundle. I do love you so. Bundle, darling, darling." Bundle lay quite still with her eyes shut. But she was now fully conscious. Bill's arms held her closely. "Bundle, darling, oh, dearest, darling Bundle. Oh, my dear love. Oh, Bundle, Bundle. What shall I do? Oh, darling one, my Bundle, my own dearest, sweetest Bundle. Oh, God, what shall I do? I've killed her. I've killed her." Reluctantly, very reluctantly, Bundle spoke. "No, you haven't, you silly idiot," she said. Bill gave a gasp of utter amazement. "Bundle, you're alive?" "Of course I'm alive." "How long have you been, I mean when did you come to?" "About 5 minutes ago." "Why didn't you open your eyes, or say something?" "Didn't want to. I was enjoying myself." "Enjoying yourself?" "Yes. Listening to all the things you were saying. You'll never say them so well again. You'll be too beastly self-conscious." Bill had turned a dark brick red. "Bundle, you really didn't mind? You know, I do love you so. I have for ages. But I never have dared tell you so." "You silly juggins," said Bundle. "Why? I thought you'd only laugh at me. I mean, you've got brains and all that, you'll marry some bigwig." "Like George Lomax," suggested Bundle. "I don't mean a fatuous ass like Cotter's. But some really fine chap who'll be worthy of you, though I don't think anyone could be that," ended Bill. "You're rather a dear, Bill. But, Bundle, seriously, could you ever? I mean, could you ever bring yourself to? Could I ever bring myself to do what? Marry me? I know I'm awfully thick-headed, but I do love you, Bundle. I'd be your dog or your slave or your anything." "You're very like a dog," said Bundle. "I like dogs. They're so friendly and faithful and warm-hearted. I think that perhaps I could just bring myself to marry you, Bill, with a great effort, you know." Bill's response to this was to relinquish his grasp of her and recoil violently. He looked at her with amazement in his eyes. "Bundle, you don't mean it?" "There's nothing for it," said Bundle. "I see I shall have to relapse into unconsciousness again." "Bundle, darling," Bill caught her to him. He was trembling violently. "Bundle, do you really mean it, do you? You don't know how much I love you." "Oh, Bill," said Bundle. There is no need to describe in detail the conversation of the next 10 minutes. It consisted mostly of repetitions. "And do you really love me?" said Bill, incredulously, for the 20th time as he at last released her. "Yes, yes, yes. Now do let's be sensible. I've got a racking head still, and I've been nearly squeezed to death by you. I want to get the hang of things. Where are we and what's happened?" For the first time, Bundle began to take stock of her surroundings. They were in the secret room, she noted, and the baize door was closed and presumably locked. They were prisoners, then. Bundle's eyes came back to Bill. Quite oblivious of her question, he was watching her with adoring eyes. "Bill, darling," said Bundle, "pull yourself together. We've got to get out of here." "Eh?" said Bill. What? Oh, yes. That'll be all right. No difficulty about that. It's being in love makes you feel like that, said Bundle. I feel rather the same myself. As though everything's easy and possible. So it is, said Bill. Now that I know you care for me. Stop it, said Bundle. Once we begin again, any serious conversation will be hopeless. Unless you pull yourself together and become sensible, I shall very likely change my mind. I shan't let you, said Bill. You don't think that once having got you I'd be such a fool as to let you go, do you? You would not coerce me against my will, I hope, said Bundle grandiloquently. Wouldn't I, said Bill. You just watch me do it, that's all. You really are rather a darling, Bill. I was afraid you might be too meek, but I see there's going to be no danger of that. In another half hour you'd be ordering me about. Oh, dear, we're getting silly again. Now, look here, Bill, we've got to get out of here. I tell you that'll be quite all right. I shall. He broke off, obedient to a pressure from Bundle's hand. She was leaning forward, listening intently. Yes, she had not been mistaken. A step was crossing the outer room. The key was thrust into the lock and turned. Bundle held her breath. Was it Jimmy coming to rescue them, or was it someone else? The door opened and the black-bearded Mr. Moskarovsky stood on the threshold. Immediately Bill took a step forward, standing in front of Bundle. Look here, he said, I want a word with you privately. The Russian did not reply for a minute or two. He stood stroking his long, silky, black beard and smiling quietly to himself. So, he said at last, it is like that. Very well. The lady will be pleased to come with me. It's all right, Bundle, said Bill. Leave it to me. You go with this chap. Nobody's going to hurt you. I know what I'm doing. Bundle rose obediently. That note of authority in Bill's voice was new to her. He seemed absolutely sure of himself and confident of being able to deal with the situation. Bundle wondered vaguely what it was that Bill had, or thought he had, up his sleeve. She passed out of the room in front of the Russian. He followed her, closing the door behind him and locking it. This way, please, he said. He indicated the staircase and she mounted obediently to the floor above. Here she was directed to pass into a small, frosy room, which she took to be Alfred's bedroom. Moskarovsky said, You will wait here quietly, please. There must be no noise. Then he went out, closing the door behind him and locking her in. Bundle sat down on a chair. Her head was aching badly still and she felt incapable of sustained thought. Bill seemed to have the situation well in hand. Sooner or later, she supposed, someone would come and let her out. The minutes passed. Bundle's watch had stopped, but she judged that over an hour had passed since the Russian had brought her here. What was happening? What, indeed, had happened? At last she heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Moskarovsky once more. He spoke very formally to her. Lady Eileen Brent, you are wanted at an emergency meeting of the Seven Dial Society. Please follow me. He led the way down the stairs and Bundle followed him. He opened the door of the secret chamber and Bundle passed in, catching her breath in surprise as she did so. She was seeing for the second time what she had only had a glimpse of the first time through her peephole. The masked figures were sitting round the table. As she stood there, taken aback by the suddenness of it, Moskarovsky slipped into his place, adjusting his clock mask as he did so. But this time the chair at the head of the table was occupied. Number 7 was in his place. Bundle's heart beat violently. She was standing at the foot of the table directly facing him and she stared and stared at the mocking piece of hanging stuff, with the clock dial on it, that hit his features. He sat quite immovable and Bundle got an odd sensation of power radiating from him. His inactivity was not the inactivity of weakness, and she wished violently, almost hysterically, that he would speak, that he would make some sign, some gesture, not just sit there like a gigantic spider in the middle of its web waiting remorselessly for its prey. She shivered, and as she did so Moskarovsky rose. His voice, smooth, silky, persuasive, seemed curiously far away. "Lady Eileen, you have been present unasked at the secret councils of this society. It is therefore necessary that you should identify yourself with our aims and ambitions. The place 2 o'clock, you may notice, is vacant. It is that place that is offered to you." Bundle gasped. The thing was like a fantastic nightmare. Was it possible that she, Bundle Brent, was being asked to join a murderous secret society? Had the same proposition been made to Bill, and had he refused indignantly? "I can't do that," she said bluntly. "Do not answer precipitately." She fancied that Moskarovsky, beneath his clock mask, was smiling significantly into his beard. "You do not as yet know, Lady Eileen, what it is you are refusing." "I can make a pretty good guess," said Bundle. "Can you?" It was the voice of 7 o'clock. It awoke some vague chord of memory in Bundle's brain. Surely she knew that voice. Very slowly number 7 raised a hand to his head and fumbled with the fastening of the mask. Bundle held her breath. At last, she was going to know. The mask fell. Bundle found herself looking into the expressionless, wooden face of Superintendent Battle. Chapter 32. Bundle is dumbfounded. "That's right," said Battle, as Moskarovsky leapt up and came round to Bundle. "Get a chair for her. It's been a bit of a shock, I can see." Bundle sank down on a chair. She felt limp and faint with surprise. Battle went on talking in a quiet, comfortable way wholly characteristic of him. "You didn't expect to see me, Lady Eileen." "No, and no more did some of the others sitting round this table. Mr. Moskarovsky's been my lieutenant in a manner of speaking. He's been in the know all along. But most of the others have taken their orders blindly from him." Still Bundle said no word. She was, a most unusual state of affairs for her, simply incapable of speech. Battle nodded at her comprehendingly, seeming to understand the state of her feelings. "You'll have to get rid of 1 or 2 preconceived ideas of yours, I'm afraid, Lady Eileen. About this society, for instance, I know it's common enough in books, a secret organization of criminals with a mysterious supercriminal at the head of it whom no one ever sees. That sort of thing may exist in real life, but I can only say that I've never come across anything of the sort, and I've had a good deal of experience one way or another. But there's a lot of romance in the world, Lady Eileen. People, especially young people, like reading about such things, and they like still better really doing them. I'm going to introduce you now to a very creditable band of amateurs that has done remarkably fine work for my department, work that nobody else could have done. If they've chosen rather melodramatic trappings, well, why shouldn't they? They've been willing to face real danger, danger of the very worst kind, and they've done it for these reasons: love of danger for its own sake, which to my mind is a very healthy sign in these safety first days, and an honest wish to serve their country. And now, Lady Eileen, I'm going to introduce you. First of all, there's Mr. Moskarovsky, whom you already know in a manner of speaking. As you're aware, he runs the club and he runs a host of other things too. He's our most valuable secret anti-Bolshevist agent in England. Number 5 is Count Andras of the Hungarian embassy, a very near and dear friend of the late Mr. Gerald Wade. Number 4 is Mr. Hayward Phelps, an American journalist, whose British sympathies are very keen and whose aptitude for scenting news is remarkable. Number 3. He stopped, smiling, and Bundle stared dumbfounded into the sheepish, grinning face of Bill Eversley. Number 2, went on Battle in a graver voice, can only show an empty place. It is the place belonging to Mr. Ronald Devereux, a very gallant young gentleman who died for his country if any man ever did. Number 1, well, number 1 was Mr. Gerald Wade, another very gallant gentleman who died in the same way. His place was taken, not without some grave misgivings on my part, by a lady who has proved her fitness to have it and who has been a great help to us. The last to do so, number 1, removed her mask, and Bundle looked without surprise into the beautiful, dark face of Countess Radsky. "I might have known," said Bundle resentfully, "that you were too completely the beautiful foreign adventuress to be anything of the kind really." "But you don't know the real joke," said Bill. "Bundle, this is Babe Street Moore. You remember my telling you about her and what a ripping actress she was, and she's about proved it." "That's so," said Mississippi Street Moore in pure transatlantic nasal. "But it's not a terrible lot of credit to me, because Papa and Mama came from that part of Europe, so I got the patter fairly easy. Gee, but I nearly gave myself away once at the Abbey, talking about gardens." She paused and then said abruptly, It's not been just fun. You see, I was kinder engaged to Ronnie, and when he handed in his checks, well, I had to do something to track down the skunk who murdered him. That's all." "I'm completely bewildered," said Bundle. "Nothing is what it seems." "It's very simple, Lady Eileen," said Superintendent Battle. "It began with some of the young people wanting a bit of excitement. It was Mr. Wade who first got on to me. He suggested the formation of a band of what you might call amateur workers to do a bit of Secret Service work. I warned him that it might be dangerous, but he wasn't the kind to weigh that in the balance. I made it plain to him that anyone who came in must do so on that understanding. But, bless you, that wasn't going to stop any of Mr. Wade's friends. And so the thing began." "But what was the object of it all?" asked Bundle. "We wanted a certain man, wanted him badly. He wasn't an ordinary crook. He worked in Mr. Wade's world, a kind of Raffles, but much more dangerous than any Raffles ever was or could be. He was out for big stuff, international stuff. Twice already valuable secret inventions had been stolen, and clearly stolen by someone who had inside knowledge. The professionals had had a try, and failed. Then the amateurs took on, and succeeded." "Succeeded?" "Yes, but they didn't come out of it unscathed. The man was dangerous. 2 lives fell victim to him and he got away with it. But the 7 Dials stuck to it. And as I say, they succeeded. Thanks to Mr. Eversley, the man was caught at last red-handed." "Who was he?" asked Bundle. "Do I know him?" "You know him very well, Lady Eileen. His name is Mr. Jimmy Thesiger, and he was arrested this afternoon." Chapter 33. Battle explains. Superintendent Battle settled to explain. He spoke comfortably and cozily. "I didn't suspect him myself for a long time. The first hint of it I had was when I heard what Mr. Devereux's last words had been. Naturally, you took them to mean that Mr. Devereux was trying to send word to Mr. Thesiger that the 7 Dials had killed him. That's what the words seemed to mean on their face value. But of course I knew that that couldn't be so. It was the 7 Dials that Mr. Devereux wanted told, and what he wanted them told was something about Mr. Jimmy Thesiger. The thing seemed incredible, because Mr. Devereux and Mr. Thesiger were close friends. But I remembered something else, that these thefts must have been committed by someone who was absolutely in the know. Someone who, if not in the Foreign Office himself, was in the way of hearing all its chit-chat. And I found it very hard to find out where Mr. Thesiger got his money. The income his father left him was a small one, yet he was able to live at a most expensive rate. Where did the money come from? I knew that Mr. Wade had been very excited by something that he had found out. He was quite sure that he was on the right track. He didn't confide in anyone about what he thought the track was, but he did say something to Mr. Devereux about being on the point of making sure. That was just before they both went down to Chimneys for that weekend. As you know, Mr. Wade died there, apparently from an overdose of a sleeping draught. It seemed straightforward enough, but Mr. Devereux did not accept that explanation for a minute. He was convinced that Mr. Wade had been very cleverly put out of the way and that someone in the house must actually be the criminal we were all after. He came, I think, very near confiding in Mr. Thesiger, for he certainly had no suspicions of him at that moment. But something held him back. Then he did rather a curious thing. He arranged 7 clocks upon the mantelpiece, throwing away the 8th. It was meant as a symbol that the 7 dials would revenge the death of one of their members, and he watched eagerly to see if anyone betrayed themselves or showed signs of perturbation. And it was Jimmy Thesiger who poisoned Jerry Wade? Yes, he slipped the stuff into a whiskey and soda which Mr. Wade had downstairs before retiring to bed. That's why he was already feeling sleepy when he wrote that letter to Miss Wade. Then the footman, Bauer, hadn't anything to do with it, asked Bundle. Bauer was one of our people, Lady Eileen. It was thought likely that our crook would go for her Eberhard's invention and Bauer was got into the house to watch events on our behalf. But he wasn't able to do much. As I say, Mr. Thesiger administered the fatal dose easily enough. Later, when everyone was asleep, a bottle, glass and empty chloral bottle were placed by Mr. Wade's bedside by Mr. Thesiger. Mr. Wade was unconscious then, and his fingers were probably pressed round the glass and the bottle so that they should be found there if any questions should arise. I don't know what effect the 7 clocks on the mantelpiece made on Mr. Thesiger. He certainly didn't let on anything to Mr. Devereux. All the same, I think he had a bad 5 minutes now and again thinking of them. And I think he kept a pretty wary eye on Mr. Devereux after that. We don't know exactly what happened next. No one saw much of Mr. Devereux after Mr. Wade's death. But it is clear that he worked along the same lines that he knew Mr. Wade had been working on and reached the same result, namely, that Mr. Thesiger was the man. I fancy, too, that he was betrayed in the same way. You mean? Through Miss Lorraine Wade. Mr. Wade was devoted to her. I believe he hoped to marry her. She wasn't really his sister, of course, and there is no doubt that he told her more than he should have done. But Miss Lorraine Wade was devoted body and soul to Mr. Thesiger. She would do anything he told her. She passed on the information to him. In the same way, later, Mr. Devereux was attracted to her, and probably warned her against Mr. Thesiger. So Mr. Devereux in turn was silenced, and died trying to send word to the 7 dials that his murderer was Mr. Thesiger. How ghastly, cried Bundle. If I had only known. Well, it didn't seem likely. In fact, I could hardly credit it myself. But then we came to the affair at the Abbey. You will remember how awkward it was, especially awkward for Mr. Eversley here. You and Mr. Thesiger were hand in glove. Mr. Eversley had already been embarrassed by your insisting on being brought to this place, and when he found that you had actually overheard what went on at a meeting, he was dumbfounded. The superintendent paused and a twinkle came into his eye. So was I, Lady Eileen. I never dreamt of such a thing being possible. You put one over on me there all right. Well, Mr. Eversley was in a dilemma. He couldn't let you into the secret of the 7 dials without letting Mr. Thesiger in also, and that would never do. It all suited Mr. Thesiger very well, of course, for it gave him a bona fide reason for getting himself asked to the Abbey, which made things much easier for him. I may say that the 7 dials had already sent a warning letter to Mr. Lomax. That was to ensure his applying to me for assistance, so that I should be able to be on the spot in a perfectly natural manner. I made no secret of my presence, as you know. And again the superintendent's eyes twinkled. Well, ostensibly, Mr. Eversley and Mr. Thesiger were to divide the night into 2 watches. Really, Mr. Eversley and Mississippi Street Moore did so. She was on guard at the library window when she heard Mr. Thesiger coming and had to dart behind the screen. And now comes the cleverness of Mr. Thesiger. Up to a point he told a perfectly true story, and I must admit that with the fight and everything, I was distinctly shaken, and began to wonder whether he had had anything to do with the theft at all, or whether we were completely on the wrong track. There were one or two suspicious circumstances that pointed in an entirely different direction, and I can tell you I didn't know what to make of things, when something turned up to clinch matters. I found the burnt glove in the fireplace with the teeth marks on it, and then, well, I knew that I'd been right after all. But, upon my word, he was a clever one. What actually happened, said Bundle. Who was the other man? There wasn't any other man. Listen, and I'll show you how in the end I reconstructed the whole story. To begin with, Mr. Thesiger and Miss Wade are in this together. And they have a rendezvous for an exact time. Miss Wade comes over in her car, climbs through the fence and comes up to the house. She's got a perfectly good story if anyone stops her, the one she told eventually. But she arrived unmolested on the terrace just after the clock had struck 2. Now, I may say to begin with that she was seen coming in. My men saw her, but they had orders to stop nobody coming in, only going out. I wanted, you see, to find out as much as possible. Miss Wade arrives on the terrace, and at that minute a parcel falls at her feet and she picks it up. A man comes down the ivy and she starts to run. What happens next? The struggle, and presently the revolver shots. What will everyone do? Rush to the scene of the fight. And Miss Lorraine Wade could have left the grounds and driven off with the formula safely in her possession. But things don't happen quite like that. Miss Wade runs straight into my arms. And at that moment the game changes. It's no longer attack but defense. Miss Wade tells her story. It is perfectly true and perfectly sensible. And now we come to Mr. Thesiger. One thing struck me at once. The bullet wound alone couldn't have caused him to faint. Either he had fallen and hit his head, or, well, he hadn't fainted at all. Later we had Miss St. Moore's story. It agreed perfectly with Mr. Thesiger's. There was only one suggestive point. Mississippi Street Moore said that after the lights were turned out and Mr. Thesiger went over to the window, he was so still that she thought he must have left the room and gone outside. Now, if anyone is in the room, you can hardly help hearing their breathing if you are listening for it. Supposing, then, that Mr. Thesiger had gone outside. Where next? Up the ivy to Mr. O'Rourke's room, Mr. O'Rourke's whiskey and soda having been doped the night before. He gets the papers, throws them down to the girl, climbs down the ivy again, and starts the fight. That's easy enough when you come to think of it. Knock the tables down, stagger about, speak in your own voice and then in a hoarse half-whisper. And then, the final touch, the 2 revolver shots. His own Colt automatic, bought openly the day before, is fired at an imaginary assailant. Then, with his left-gloved hand, he takes from his pocket the small Mauser pistol and shoots himself through the fleshy part of the right arm. He flings the pistol through the window, tears off the glove with his teeth, and throws it into the fire. When I arrive he is lying on the floor in a faint. Bundle drew a deep breath. You didn't realize all this at the time, Superintendent Battle? No, that I didn't. I was taken in as much as anyone could be. It wasn't till long afterwards that I pieced it all together. Finding the glove was the beginning of it. Then I made Sir Oswald throw the pistol through the window. It fell a good way farther on than it should have done. But a man who is right-handed doesn't throw nearly as far with the left hand. Even then it was only suspicion, and a very faint suspicion at that. But there was one point struck me. The papers were obviously thrown down for someone to pick up. If Miss Wade was there by accident, who was the real person? Of course, for those who weren't in the know, that question was answered easily enough, the Countess. But there I had the pull over you. I knew the Countess was all right. So what follows? Why, the idea that the papers had actually been picked up by the person they were meant for. And the more I thought of it, the more it seemed to me a very remarkable coincidence that Miss Wade should have arrived at the exact moment she did. It must have been very difficult for you when I came to you full of suspicion about the Countess. It was, Lady Eileen. I had to say something to put you off the scent. And it was very difficult for Mr. Eversley here, with the lady coming out of a dead faint and no knowing what she might say. I understand Bill's anxiety now, said Bundle. And the way he kept urging her to take time and not talk till she felt quite all right. Poor old Bill, said Mississippi Street Moore. That poor baby had to be vamped against his will, getting madder 'n a hornet every minute. Well, said Superintendent Battle, there it was. I suspected Mr. Thesiger, but I couldn't get definite proof. On the other hand, Mr. Thesiger himself was rattled. He realized more or less what he was up against in the 7 Dials, but he wanted badly to know who number 7 was. He got himself asked to the Coots under the impression that Sir Oswald Coote was number 7. I suspected Sir Oswald, said Bundle, especially when he came in from the garden that night. I never suspected him, said Battle. But I don't mind telling you that I did have my suspicions of that young chap, his secretary. Pongo, said Bill. Not old Pongo. Yes, Mr. Eversley, old Pongo as you call him. A very efficient gentleman and one that could have put anything through if he'd a mind to. I suspected him partly because he'd been the one to take the clocks into Mr. Wade's room that night. It would have been easy for him to put the bottle and glass by the bedside then. And then, for another thing, he was left-handed. That glove pointed straight to him, if it hadn't been for one thing. What? The teeth marks. Only a man whose right hand was incapacitated would have needed to tear off that glove with his teeth. So Pongo was cleared. So Pongo was cleared, as you say. I'm sure it would be a great surprise to Mr. Bateman to know he was ever suspected. It would, agreed Bill. A solemn card, a silly ass like Pongo. How you could ever think. Well, as far as that goes, Mr. Thesiger was what you might describe as an empty-headed young ass of the most brainless description. One of the two was playing a part. When I decided that it was Mr. Thesiger, I was interested to get Mr. Bateman's opinion of him. All along, Mr. Bateman had the gravest suspicions of Mr. Thesiger and frequently said as much to Sir Oswald. It's curious, said Bill, but Pongo always is right. It's maddening. Well, as I say, went on Superintendent Battle, we got Mr. Thesiger fairly on the run, badly rattled over this 7 Dials business and uncertain just where the danger lay. That we got him in the end was solely through Mr. Eversley. He knew what he was up against, and he risked his life cheerfully. But he never dreamt that you would be dragged into it, Lady Eileen. My God, no, said Bill with feeling. He went round to Mr. Thesiger's rooms with a cooked-up tale, continued Battle. He was to pretend that certain papers of Mr. Devereux's had come into his hands. Those papers were to suggest a suspicion of Mr. Thesiger. Naturally, as the honest friend, Mr. Eversley rushed round, sure that Mr. Thesiger would have an explanation. We calculated that if we were right, Mr. Thesiger would try and put Mr. Eversley out of the way, and we were fairly certain as to the way he'd do it. Sure enough, Mr. Thesiger gave his guest a whiskey and soda. During the minute or two that his host was out of the room, Mr. Eversley poured that into a jar on the mantelpiece, but he had to pretend, of course, that the drug was taking effect. It would be slow, he knew, not sudden. He began his story, and Mr. Thesiger at first denied it all indignantly, but as soon as he saw, or thought he saw, that the drug was taking effect, he admitted everything and told Mr. Eversley that he was the third victim. When Mr. Eversley was nearly unconscious, Mr. Thesiger took him down to the car and helped him in. The hood was up. He must already have telephoned to you unknown to Mr. Eversley. He made a clever suggestion to you. You were to say that you were taking Miss Wade home. You made no mention of a message from him. Later, when your body was found here, Miss Wade would swear that you had driven her home and gone up to London with the idea of penetrating into this house by yourself. Mr. Eversley continued to play his part, that of the unconscious man. I may say that as soon as the two young men had left Jermyn Street, one of my men gained admission and found the doctored whiskey, which contained enough hydrochloride of morphia to kill 2 men. Also the car they were in was followed. Mr. Thesiger drove out of town to a well-known golf course, where he showed himself for a few minutes, speaking of playing around. That, of course, was for an alibi, should one be needed. He left the car with Mr. Eversley in it a little way down the road. Then he drove back to town and to the Seven Dials Club. As soon as he saw Alfred leave, he drove up to the door, spoke to Mr. Eversley as he got out in case you might be listening, and came into the house and played his little comedy. When he pretended to go for a doctor, he really only slammed the door and then crept quietly upstairs and hid behind the door of this room, where Miss Wade would presently send you up on some excuse. Mr. Eversley, of course, was horror-struck when he saw you, but he thought it best to keep up the part he was playing. He knew our people were watching the house, and he imagined that there was no immediate danger intended to you. He could always come to life at any moment. When Mr. Thesiger threw his revolver on the table and apparently left the house, it seemed safer than ever. As for the next bit, he paused, looking at Bill. Perhaps you'd like to tell that, sir. I was still lying on that bally sofa, said Bill, trying to look done in and getting the fidgets worse and worse. Then I heard someone run down the stairs, and Lorraine got up and went to the door. I heard Thesiger's voice, but not what he said. I heard Lorraine say, "That's all right, it's gone splendidly." Then he said, "Help me carry him up. It will be a bit of a job, but I want them both together there, a nice little surprise for number 7. I didn't quite understand what they were jawing about, but they hauled me up the stairs somehow or other. It was a bit of a job for them. I made myself a dead weight all right. They heaved me in here, and then I heard Lorraine say, 'You're sure it's all right? She won't come round?' And Jimmy said, 'The damned blackguard, no fear.' I hit with all my might. They went away and locked the door, and then I opened my eyes and saw you. My God, Bundle, I shall never feel so perfectly awful again. I thought you were dead." "I suppose my hat saved me," said Bundle. "Partly," said Superintendent Battle. "But partly it was Mr. Thesiger's wounded arm. He didn't realize it himself, but it had only half its usual strength. Still, that's all no credit to the department. We didn't take the care of you we ought to have done, Lady Eileen, and it's a black blot on the whole business." "I'm very tough," said Bundle. "And also rather lucky. What I can't get over is Lorraine being in it. She was such a gentle little thing." "Ah," said the superintendent. "So was the Pentonville murderess that killed 5 children. You can't go by that. She's got bad blood in her. Her father ought to have seen the inside of a prison more than once. You've got her too." Superintendent Battle nodded. "I dare say they won't hang her, juries are soft-hearted. But young Thesiger will swing all right, and a good thing too, a more utterly depraved and callous criminal I never met. And now," he added, "if your head isn't aching too badly, Lady Eileen, what about a little celebration? There's a nice little restaurant round the corner." Bundle heartily agreed. "I'm starving, Superintendent Battle. Besides," she looked round, "I've got to get to know all my colleagues." "The 7 Dials," said Bill. "Hurrah! Some fizz is what we need. Do they run to fizz at this place, Battle?" "You won't have anything to complain of, sir. You leave it to me." "Superintendent Battle," said Bundle, "you are a wonderful man. I'm sorry you're married already. As it is, I shall have to put up with Bill." Chapter 34. Lord Caterham approves. "Father," said Bundle, "I've got to break a piece of news to you. You're going to lose me." "Nonsense," said Lord Caterham. "Don't tell me that you're suffering from galloping consumption or a weak heart or anything like that, because I simply don't believe it." "It's not death," said Bundle. "It's marriage." "Very nearly as bad," said Lord Caterham. I suppose I shall have to come to the wedding, all dressed up in tight, uncomfortable clothes, and give you away. And Lomax may think it necessary to kiss me in the vestry. Good heavens! You don't think I'm going to marry George, do you? Cried Bundle. Well, something like that seemed to be in the wind last time I saw you, said her father. Yesterday morning, you know. I'm going to be married to someone 100 times nicer than George, said Bundle. I hope so, I'm sure, said Lord Caterham. But one never knows. I don't feel you're really a good judge of character, Bundle. You told me that young Thesiger was a cheerful inefficient, and from all I hear now it seems that he was one of the most efficient criminals of the day. The sad thing is that I never met him. I was thinking of writing my reminiscences soon, with a special chapter on murderers I have met, and by a purely technical oversight, I never met this young man. Don't be silly, said Bundle. You know you haven't got the energy to write reminiscences or anything else. I wasn't actually going to write them myself, said Lord Caterham. I believe that's never done. But I met a very charming girl the other day and that's her special job. She collects the material and does all the actual writing. And what do you do? Oh, just give her a few facts for half an hour every day. Nothing more than that. After a slight pause, Lord Caterham said, she was a nice-looking girl, very restful and sympathetic. Father, said Bundle, I have a feeling that without me you will run into deadly danger. Different kinds of danger suit different kinds of people, said Lord Caterham. He was moving away, when he turned back and said over his shoulder. By the way, Bundle, who are you marrying? I was wondering, said Bundle, when you were going to ask me that. I'm going to marry Bill Eversleigh. The egoist thought it over for a minute. Then he nodded in complete satisfaction. Excellent, he said. He's Scratch, isn't he? He and I can play together in the foursomes in the autumn meeting.